This is going to be a very high-level presentation. We only have an hour, frankly. So what I'm going to do is introduce you to some core concepts in JavaScript. And I'm going to do this through a series of analogies, 9 total analogies going back to what you should be comfortable with in the land of Oracle. Okay? All of these examples will be using jQuery. For those of you who are not familiar with jQuery, to put it simply, it's a JavaScript library that makes working with JavaScript very easy. It's now built into Apex, so you don't have to worry about installing it. It's there, and you can take advantage of it. The first analogy. A web page is nothing more than a data set. Think about a table, really, okay? Only in a web page we have a few changes. Essentially, elements are rows, and attributes are moved inside of elements. Except text, but ignore that for now. The hierarchy in our web page is established by the page layout, rather than, as you'll see here in a moment, what we might typically use in a table, an ID column, and a parent ID column. Also, we do have IDs in HTML web pages, and they should be unique, like a primary key. The only thing is they're not required. But if you do add an ID to an element, it should be unique in the web page. Here's a web page. This is the web page we're going to be working with today. And really, it's a stripped-down version of what you would see under the covers if you looked at an Apex web page. What I want you to do is focus on the first 5 elements, really. We start with HTML. Under that, we have a head element. Under that, we have a title element, and that title, of course, has some of that text I was referring to. And we go to body. And below body, we have a form. Now, form is the first one. That's the last one I want you to pay attention to now. Form is the first one that actually has some of these attributes. And we're used to attributes, only we see them typically in a different way, right? We see them as columns in a table. Go back to a data set. If you mix this up a little bit, we can have the same data in a format that we're probably more familiar with. It looked something more like this, right? We've all seen CSV files, and we've loaded these into tables. But let's stay with the concept of a CSV file for now. The first row identifies our columns, and you can see we have ID and parent ID. And rather than using the page layout to establish the hierarchy, we're using these columns to establish a basic hierarchical relationship amongst the various elements. As you can see, the third column is the element. So we have one row here for every element you saw before in the web page. Everything else, just attributes about the element. If you look, number 1 here, the first one is the line 2, ID 1. That's the HTML element. And the head element, which was below the HTML, you can see it's number 2, ID 2, but its parent ID simply links back up to number 1, right? And then if you get all the way down to line 6, or ID 5, we have that form element again. And you can see its attributes off to the right there. Again, we just reorganize this. We come back to the HTML web page. All it is data in a different format. We're just not used to it yet. Analogy number 2. When we take the web page and we put it into a browser, what we get is a lot like when we take that data set, that CSV file, and we move it into a table. The DOM, or the document object model, which, as soon as a PL SQL developer hears object, we get scared and run away, right? It's not really that bad. When we think of table, we think of database object, right? Well, when you put a web page into the browser, you get a DOM, just a different object. Essentially, it becomes alive. When we have a table in the database, we can do things like select rows. We can do inserts, updates, and deletes. And of course, we can add and remove columns, right? You can do more, but these are the most common operations you're doing with tables. When you take the web page and you put it into the browser, you can do the same kinds of operations. We can select elements. Remember, our rows have become elements. We can also do inserts, updates, and deletes. And of course, we can add and remove, rather than columns, we can add and remove attributes. Here again is our CSV file. We move that into the database, we get a table, right? We're used to working with tables. Here is our HTML document. Put that into a browser, and we get this. Now this, of course, is what we see on the front end. But behind the scenes, the browser has gone through that HTML content here, and it's looked at all these elements and essentially turned them into objects that we can work with. Analogy number 3. Firebug is to your browser what SQL Developer is to your database. Everybody here uses a tool to interface with the database, right? It's probably either SQL Developer or Toad, right? And we need tools to work with JavaScript at this point. It's really important. If you try to do it without a good tool, it's not going to work out very well. Firebug actually has a lot of features that are very similar to what we see in SQL Developer. We can view or browse the various objects. We can modify them. There's even a command line tool and debugging capabilities built in. Let's take a look. Here we have SQL Developer, and I'm looking at my HTML table. Right, so we can browse the various elements. If I wanted to, I could come in and make a change to one of them. Here's our HTML document. At the bottom here, you see Firebug. This is just a plugin. It's freely available. Once you open it up, I'm going to show you just a few of the features here. We're not going to do all of them. Here's the HTML tab. And you can then use this select option here. And when you hover over various elements, you can see them below. So this is a lot like SQL Developer, right? We can see what's going on with our objects. Here's that form again. I can come down here and do the reverse. I can select over the elements, and they're highlighted above. We also have a command line tool here. And this is sort of like this. Right, we can type whatever we want here. We can run ad hoc queries. Or we can do the same. See the results down here? We can do the same with Firebug. I'm using console.log to just put a little output over here on the left. It's a lot like dbms output.putline, right? Similar stuff. So we need tools like this to work with JavaScript effectively. Analogy number 4. jQuery selectors are like SQL queries for your web page. We're all used to running ad hoc queries on our tables. The truth of the matter is that jQuery, think of the name, jQuery, right? It can do the same thing with a web page. And in fact, just about anything in jQuery always starts with one of these selectors. So selectors are really important. I'm going to show you 4 total examples. One of the differences is that when you use a select statement in Oracle, especially in a tool like SQL Dev or whatever, you're just used to seeing the data come back. That's not exactly how it works with jQuery. You end up with a jQuery object. We'll get into the detail of that a little bit later, but just keep that in mind for now. Almost everything in jQuery starts with a selector. Here's the first example. In SQL, you might do a select count star on our HTML table. And of course, you'd expect to see essentially all of the elements or all of the rows in the table. Or, in this case, just a count star, the count of those rows, right? In jQuery, we can do the same thing. The selector is that apex.jQuery. This is the way in which jQuery has been exposed in Apex. It's been done this way to avoid any conflicts if anybody had jQuery previously installed. So the equivalent for account star, here we have apex.jQuery, that starts our selector, and in parentheses, we're saying star, so the same kind of syntax. Only to get the count, I need to access length. That's the main difference. We take this query, execute it in SQL Dev, we get a count of 33 elements. If I take this jQuery selector, and we run it down here in our command line interface, I get 34. I've actually added a little bit because I needed to include the JavaScript library that we're using, jQuery, and I just didn't want to confuse you with the extra stuff. I'm keeping the content here light, especially because that's already done for you in Apex now. You don't have to worry about it. Make sense? Simple enough? Folks, if you have questions at any point in time, feel free to raise your hands. I'd rather you ask questions while it's still fresh in your head. Select number 2. This time, in SQL, we've added a where clause. So this time it's select count star from HTML table where the element equals input. If you're familiar with HTML, the document I showed you before, there were actually 3 inputs. It may have looked like 2. We had 2 text inputs, and then there was a button. And the button is actually an input as well. So there are 3 inputs. So if I was to run this, I would expect to get a count of 3. In jQuery, we can do where clauses as well. You can see down here, it just goes in between the parentheses. So apex.jQuery, we're selecting the inputs, and again, I'm using length for the count star. Plug it into SQL Dev. Execute it, we get our count of 3. Oop, that's not going to work there. Bring it into the browser, execute it here, we get our count of 3. So we can use where clauses with our jQuery selectors. All right, we have to get the right elements before we can work with them. Select number 3. This time, same basic concept, just a where clause, but this time we're getting more selective. We're selecting by ID. So we expect, of course, a single row to come back in the SQL example. The jQuery example, we can do that as well. I've listed 2 here, only I'm using the first one, the ID. When we want to select by ID using jQuery, you simply put a hash before the ID you're looking for. Again, if you've added an element to an HTML web page and it's using an attribute of ID, it should be unique across the entire web page, all of the elements. Now, there's also a class attribute, and if you're not familiar with HTML, it's probably just going to confuse you if I went into it now, so I'm going to gloss over it, but just remember, if you want to select by class, think of a grouping of elements, you just replace the hash with a period. It's that easy. Now I've modified this query a little bit to run in SQL Dev because, of course, the IDs in our table example, to establish that hierarchical relationship, they're not in the text format. right? But here we have ID equals 5. We get one element. If I show you the table and we see ID 5, you can see that is the form. If we follow that across, you can see its attributes. Apply the same concept then with jQuery. This time I'm selecting a single element. We run it and we get a result of 1. So you can get really selective with jQuery. Final example here. Thus far, I've been doing count star a lot, right? We don't use that very often. You know, it's useful occasionally. But more often, we're actually going to select some kind of column or attribute regarding a row. So in SQL this time, same row, we just saw the element or the row in the table. Remember those attributes off to the side? Well, one of those was one of the columns was action. So if I select action from the table for that particular row, I'd expect to see the actual value, right? We can do the same thing in jQuery. This time the same selector, only rather than .length, which would give me the count, I'm using the method attr for attribute. And I simply specify which I want. It looks very much alike, right? Run this one. We get the value flow accept. You look in the table, look under action, there's flow accept. Same thing in jQuery. Bring this in and run it. You can see it down here. Let me clear this out and run that again. Selector works just the same, right? We can access attributes. Okay? Everybody with me so far? Question?
In the jQuery, what parts are case sensitive?
Well, good question. The question was, is basically is JavaScript case sensitive? And the answer is yes. With PL SQL, it's not a case sensitive language, of course, but when we put quotes around something, we're working with actual data, then things do become case sensitive. With JavaScript, everything's case sensitive. So that's an important distinction. I avoided the side-by-side comparison of the language intentionally because I didn't want to get bogged down in the details, right? High-level overview here. So you can see, using attribute, you're able to essentially select attributes or what we refer to as columns for our data. Analogy number 5. Speaking of attribute, if we modify it just a little bit, we can use it differently. jQuery's attribute can also be used a lot like SQL's set clause in an update statement. Only something has to work a little different. Previously, we passed in a single parameter, right? What attribute did we want back? When we pass in 2 parameters, the attribute followed by the value, then it updates the attribute. You can see SQL at the top. We're updating the HTML table, setting size equal to 30, where ID equals job title. The jQuery equivalent below does the exact same thing. We're selecting job title by ID, the hash before ID, and we're setting the attribute size equal to 30. If I were to run this update in SQL Dev, again, I've had to modify the query a little bit. Size was not a valid column name, so I've kind of spoofed it. But if we run that, we get one row updated. And before I refresh this, I'll come down. And you can see this element here. 10. Do the refresh. And it's now 30. We're familiar with that. Let's do the same in a web page. paste it in. And this text element here has a size of 30 already. The one below it is currently 10. We run this, and now they're both 30. Okay, so we can do updates in our web page, right? Only we get instant feedback here, which is nice. This is what brings the interactivity to your end users. If we can do updates, we must be able to do inserts and deletes, right? So those two are next. We'll start with inserts. jQuery's after is a lot like SQL's insert. Now the truth of the matter is that jQuery actually has a lot of different options for doing inserts. I've just chosen a very basic one here, after. Now if I wanted to insert a new row into our HTML table, then I would run this statement here. I would add, of course, a new row. I've specified my ID and parent ID, so I'm establishing that hierarchical relationship. Only in all honesty, it would I'd need to run another update and essentially shift all the indexes around to maintain the right relationship at the table level. But ultimately, it's simple enough. We would just run the insert statement. In jQuery, we can do the same thing. I've broken this down a little bit, but essentially our selector's on the top, and I'm selecting the H1 element, and I'm then using after to add some content or insert an element into the web page that did not previously exist. If you take a look at our web page, and I focus up here on jQuery is fun. This is where it's at currently. This is the row I'm looking at now. What I want to do is essentially insert an element just below it before table. I'm not going to run the insert statement in SQL Dev, but let's take a look. At the jQuery equivalent. Look up here. We run the insert statement. And we get a new element added into the page. Frankly, there's a concept out there that I'm not going to demo today because it is more on the advanced side. Has anyone here heard of Ajax? Okay. So all Ajax really is, if I were to use another analogy that's not in the stack here today, all it really is an insert statement, but rather than having come directly from typing it in, you're essentially using a database link to go grab some data from somewhere else and then insert that into a table in a local schema. Okay? You can see I can do an insert directly, but I could have also gone off to another server, brought back some data, and then inserted that into the web page. That's essentially all Ajax is, at a very basic level. You guys are already used to all this stuff. It's just little syntax differences here and there. That's all it is. Next up, as I said before, we're going to look at delete as well. The equivalent in jQuery is remove. Question?
Yeah, the selector for the previous example was H1, which is a tag that could be lots of H1s. It's going to just get the first one.
No, that's excellent. The question was the selector I used in the previous example. Let me go back to that. The selector here was on H1. And the question was, there could be multiple H1 elements in the page. What would have happened had that been the case? Frankly, jQuery would have given me an array, and I would have had to have worked with an array. We're actually going to do that example here in a little bit when we talk more about traversing and things like that. Because technically he's right. This is a very generic selector. It's not something you would really use. We're just kind of going over core concepts here. But it brings up an important point. If you don't have the ability to select very clearly the element you want to work with, then you're going to need to learn to traverse the DOM. Start with an element that you can select, and then move over to the one that you actually want to work with. We'll see an example of that a little later. For now, we'll just look at the delete equivalent. SQL Dev, we'd run something like this. Delete from HTML table where ID equals 27. That's the job title element. I run that, of course, the row is gone from the table. jQuery equivalent. We run this. Here's job title element. And it's gone. Right? So we can both insert elements and delete them as well. Analogy number 8. Now we're getting into DOM traversal. So jQuery's parents is kind of like SQL's connect by clause. Is anybody here familiar with connect by? Right? We use that to traverse data both up and down, however we need to. There are other ways to work with hierarchical data structures in Oracle, but I'll stick with connect by. In jQuery, we have equivalents. Only, in my honest opinion, it's far easier to traverse the DOM in jQuery than it is in Oracle, right? If you just look at some of the methods we have available, next, previous, siblings, parents and children, right? You can think about a family. And these make a lot more sense than connect by, no cycle, prior, start with, right? This behemoth here is essentially, there's multiple ways to do this, but this is essentially what I would need, one way of doing what it is I want to do. So what I'm trying to do, in fact, let's take a look at the HTML document first. And I'm going to do a rollback here so I can get the page back to the way it was when we started. I'll just do a quick refresh. So if we look at the structure here, what we have here is a table. This is the way the form has been arranged, and this is used in Apex. Table body, element beneath it, and then we have 3 table rows. So the question from before is very relevant here. Let's say I want to hide this table row element here. I can't just say select the table row, right? Because I would hide all 3. There are 3 of these. So how can I target a single one? Again, multiple ways to do it, but I want to talk about traversing the DOM. So we're going to start here at table. I'm going to go down 1 level to table body. Then I'm going to go down 1 level where we see the table body's children. And then I'm going to try to select the one in the middle, the second one. Let's try to do this in SQL. Once we've selected the middle one, then I'll run an update against it, right? And Oracle would work something like this, and let's work from the inside out. We'll start with this. I'm selecting the ID and row num from HTML table where the element equals table row, using connect by prior ID equals parent ID to establish my hierarchy. And I'm starting with the table element, and we're ordering by ID. Now, of course, I don't care about the ones higher than the one I'm looking for, so I'll filter that out. Now we're down to just 2, and then I'm going to work with that result set and target the one I was looking for. Now we have the one in the middle that was ID 16. Once I have the row that I'm looking for, I can then use that ID and an update statement. So if we look at our table, we have a table row, and there's another table row in here somewhere. Table row. So this is the one I'm looking to target, and I essentially want to update this style attribute. I'm not going to remove the element from the web page. I'm simply going to hide it. And to do that, you simply need to update this style attribute, setting it equal to display:none. So we run this. It updates our row. We can refresh our table. We see that down here. All right, we do the same thing with jQuery, only again, I think it's much easier. Let's take a look, actually, at the syntax here. So here's the ridiculous SQL you might use, and here's the jQuery equivalent. We start with table, right? We just select table, and then I can use children to go down one level in the hierarchy. So we go from table to table body. I can use children again to go down one level, and that gives us all of our table rows. It returns the array. I need to filter that array. And JavaScript is a 0-based language. PL SQL is a 1-based. In JavaScript, we start everything, in terms of counting with 0. So if I want the second table row element, I need to specify 1. EQ is essentially a filter that allows me to take an array and reduce it down to a single element. Once I've done that, I can use CSS to modify that style attribute. And I'm simply setting display to none. Let's give it a shot. You're looking here, second table row element. We run it, it's gone. But if we look, it's actually still here. Display has been set to none. We simply don't see it on the page. So far, so good? Everybody with me? The final analogy is definitely the most complex, and this is the one that really throws PL SQL developers through a loop, but it doesn't need to. Events are in Oracle, and they're also in web browsers. Only in a web browser, there's a lot more events going on. You may not know it, but when you go into a web page and you start moving your mouse around, every pixel you move that mouse, an event fired. Every time you click the mouse, another event. Every time you press a key, every time you change a select list or radio button, events are firing. It's no different than a table level trigger in Oracle, right? We can add triggers onto our tables. They can be set up to fire on insert, update, and delete. So limited number of events related to tables in Oracle, lots more in JavaScript. And jQuery makes it really easy to work with events. So the analogy is events in jQuery are just a lot like triggers in Oracle. This trigger would not compile. I'm well aware of this. However, I think it serves as a good example. So create a replace trigger followed by the trigger name. Before an update of the value column on events, for each row, we're going to fire this trigger, only if we're working with a select element. If you remember the web page, there's just one little select list. So this trigger would work targeting essentially that one select list. And what I'm saying, if the value is, the new value is active, then we're going to update events, and we're going to set the disabled field equal to null. We're just clearing it out, where ID equals job title. On the flip side, else, if, in other words, the new value of our select is inactive, then we're going to disable the job title field because it's not really relevant anymore. If we take a look at our web page, again, I'm going to do a quick rollback. Here we have the jQuery equivalent. Now before I run this, just want to look at the structure here. So here's that select list. We have active and inactive. And the idea here is that when status is inactive, we want to disable this field. Currently I can click into it, I can set the focus of it and all that. Here's the jQuery syntax to essentially create that same trigger. We're using our ID selector to get that status element. And then we use a jQuery helper here for change. Right? The trigger said for update, but here we just say change. So if the status element changes, it's going to fire this anonymous block. Triggers in a way are sort of like anonymous blocks, right? They're just attached to a table. This change event takes an anonymous function. So in that way they're a bit alike and the same kind of code. If this and this is referring back then to status, what just changed. If this value equals active, then we're going to remove the attribute disabled from the job title element. Otherwise, we're going to use attr again to set the disabled attribute to disabled. Okay? Again, currently I can click in this field, we execute our new event, and I can still click in the field. Can anyone tell me why? Right? We haven't fired the trigger yet. We just essentially added the trigger. We compiled the trigger, would be the Oracle equivalent. So we move it to inactive. I can no longer access the field. Go back to active. Type all day long. Inactive, no longer useful. Okay? So events, while there are a lot more of them going on in the browser, you're already familiar with them. You just have to use jQuery to work with them a little bit differently. We have lots of extra time here, so what I want to do is show you another trigger. This one, I'm just using a jQuery selector to select a button. Now, if we look at the content here, we think we see two buttons. It's actually a bit of a trick. This one is a button. The one below it is an input with the type set to submit. They both look the same, but they're actually different. So I'm going to use a jQuery selector to select the button, which is the one on the left. And then I'm going to associate a trigger with it. And the trigger is going to fire on click. When that fires, I'm going to then select, oops, that's not going to work. I'm going to use some other jQuery selectors. I'm going to find that select element, and I'm going to set its value equal to null. And then I'm going to use another selector, and I'm going to select the inputs on the field. How many inputs are there? 3. Again, this one is an input. But I don't want this one. And it does have an ID. I can select it very explicitly. Only that's the one I don't want. So I'm using a more advanced selector here. I'm saying, give me the inputs, but then I'm filtering them, and I'm saying, don't give me the one where the ID equals submit form. So I should just get these two. I run this, and we've compiled our trigger. It's now ready to go. We hit reset form. It clears out the values. If we set a few in here and run it again, clears everything out. Right? So we're just adding the same kinds of concepts to a web page that you are already working with in Oracle. Same stuff. Okay. Let's take a look at how some of this applies in Apex. So I'm going to log into a workspace here. And of course, this is Apex 4 now, so all of the examples I've been showing you today, I've been using a syntax that will work with Apex 4.0. I'm going to go into the application builder. This isn't the workspace I want to be in. No, I'm on the wrong site. Did everybody attend the Sunday symposium? A couple of you? I did this then. I'm going to do the same concept now, a little bit differently. What we have here is an administration section of an application where we see users. If we go to create, we go to the form where we have username, first name, and last name. Now let's say I want to reconfigure the page so that first name and last name are disabled until there's a value within the username. Okay, so using jQuery and the concepts we've already covered today, before Apex 4, I'd have written something that looks like this. And I'd have been very proud of myself. We start with apex.jQuery, and I'm selecting now P106. You know how your items in Apex at the page level start with the P and then the page number? Well, when the page is rendered, the IDs are assigned to the elements. So we're selecting the username element, and I'm saying on key up, on when that event fires, run this anonymous block. And again, this refers back to username. So if username is null, then set the attribute disabled for both first and last name, set that to disabled. And if there is a value, then remove the attribute altogether. So if I run this, we come into username. Currently, once I type, we can type in there. When I remove the value, I can no longer get into these fields. Once I add some text, I can work with them. 4.0 has made this sort of a thing of the past. When they're really basic like this, let's take a look. Let's get rid of jQuery and go in behind the scenes here. And this time we're going to use dynamic actions to do the same thing. I'm going to right-click on username, and I'll go down to create dynamic action. Now, on the Sunday symposium, I did this standard example. Here I'm going to advance because at this point you're all advanced JavaScript developers. So what are we doing here? We're doing the same concept. We're disabling the first and last. Until the username has a value. So we just got to give our dynamic action a name. And then we get into the complex part. Only now all these events have been exposed to us in a rather declarative format. In fact, some of the names have been changed to make them a little bit easier to work with. So what did I do before? I did key up. That's key release here. Select that one. And I want to work with items. And because I right-clicked the item I wanted to work with, these two defaulted to the right values. We'll go into condition, and is null is fine. That's what we were working with before in the jQuery code. So if username is null, then we can select the action. Again, if username is null, I want to disable. And if it's not null, the false action, or the opposite of the other, will enable. Now, what do I want to disable and enable? Items, of course. Only, again, declarative format, right? So we're going to select first and last name, move them over, and create our dynamic action. You can see it down here. When we run the page, notice they're disabled by default. In fact, they look a little darker than mine did, right? So in addition to actually disabling the field, he's also changed the CSS a little bit to make it more evident to your users. In Firefox, we get a slight discoloration. In IE or in other browsers, you might not get any. So this is necessary to really make it obvious to end users. So really nice, even easier. As soon as we start typing, they become available. So the next steps I've listed here are to get started with jQuery using dynamic actions. And you may say, well, gosh, that was so easy. Why do I even need jQuery at this point? And the truth of the matter is that dynamic actions are very new. They're not 100%, and they probably never will be, right? What's coming out in terms of a web page is a lot of content. And sometimes you want to do very specific things. Ultimately, you may need to fall back with some jQuery code. Overcome any limitations we have in dynamic actions. And if we go back and look, at the dynamic action, you'll see a lot of things that link right back to jQuery. So it's made for jQuery. You just have to know how to use it. Right? Finally, I recommend you go to jQuery.com. If you scroll down to the bottom, see a number of books. This one's a really good one, written by one of the authors. These books are perhaps better than the website for learning. However, if you want to get started immediately and just use the website, there's another recommendation. You go under documentation, and let's say you wanted to learn more about selectors. If you click selectors here, this is very hard to understand. The format here is terrible. It will not make any sense. Look on the left, and you'll see a dynamic API browser. Use that instead. The format's a lot better. You click on selectors, it breaks them down into categories. You select your category, it breaks them down further. This is a lot more usable than the actual site. So make sure to use the dynamic API browser. Any questions, folks?
You mentioned that in the drop-down, they're mapping like the key up has been changed to key release and stuff like that. Is that a feature that we can find? It used to be like that in jQuery now.
Excellent question. You know, that's actually the question was, I apologize, that in Apex we saw that the names of the events have been changed to make things easier. But if you're familiar with JavaScript already, you know, how do you know which one to choose? And frankly, You know, I've not yet looked. I haven't clicked on the help for that. It may already be in the help, but I don't believe it is, and that's something I'll ask Patrick to add for the next release. Any other questions?
So I learned enough JavaScript to be dangerous. Should I now just kind of forget JavaScript and focus on jQuery for my...
Well, jQuery...
You need to go sometimes even back to JavaScript because it's done some of the things.
Absolutely. You use jQuery for, you know, some of the heavy stuff, and it makes a lot of that so much easier than it ever was before. But let's say, for example, you had some elements on the page that you wanted to add together, salary and maybe commission field, and you wanted to work with those and take the result and put it into a third field. Correct, right? So you're still going to have to learn about variable declarations, how to handle them and do the math, and then use another jQuery selector to put the value where you want it.
Yeah.
So yeah, you kind of sprinkle the two together. Any other questions?
I want to see if source code for dynamic actions that's going on.
You can. Essentially, what's added to the page... Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, can you see the source code for dynamic actions? And the answer is yes, but it's not in the same syntax that we're used to at this point. Essentially, what they've done is created a library. So what gets added to the page is a call to the library. Parameters are passed to the library, which does the actions. So they're in two places, and frankly, it's a little bit confusing. All the code is compiled. There are uncompiled versions, but it's certainly not what we're used to, and so it might just confuse you.
What happens when jQuery versions change?
Well, essentially, they've installed jQuery into Apex using what's known as no conflict. So they've appropriately namespaced their version of jQuery. So in fact, you could install a different version and they wouldn't interfere with each other. What will eventually happen is they're going to, of course, upgrade their copy, and I just hope that doesn't break all of your code. Any other questions? All right. Thank you all very much for coming.